what is the cognition crisis?
Perfect segue. I love it. It connects to really fundamental aspects of my life that I think about and write about. And I'm glad that you put it together so eloquently. It saved me having to make that bridge. But, let's talk about my view on the cognition crisis, and then we'll create a nice connection between what we just talked about and plasticity. But my view of the cognition crisis is that's the title of the piece I wrote several years ago. It was a follow-up in many ways to a book I wrote called The Distracted Mind. The cognition crisis is a much bigger story than what I cover in The Distracted Mind. And it's really meant to, in some ways, be a counterbalance to this term that we hear a lot about, like mental health crisis. And I think when people talk about a mental health crisis, as far as I can tell from reading as much as I can about it, they're talking about something that's very real, very tragic, and very, timely, in that there's incredible suffering going on around the world, people that are debilitated by all sorts of impairments of their brains and their minds, from emotional regulation, depression, anxiety, stress, dementia in seniors, attention deficit disorder. And it is something that has been going on for a long time and has gotten worse. Suicide, depression in teens has increased. Dementia continues to increase as our aging population increases. And so, yeah, that's very real. It's very global, and it's a really important point, and something that we need to address. The cognition crisis idea was my attempt to say, that is not the full problem, that the problem extends beyond people who have clinical diagnoses, that we are all, as a species, in the midst of a crisis of our minds, of our thinking, broadly defined, cognition broadly defined here. So our attention, our memory, our perceptual abilities, our decision-making, our imagination and creativity, our emotional regulation, our empathy, our compassion, just the whole broad scope of how we work and function, I think, is not up to the task of living in this complex planet and, this world that we have created, the human, interconnected, high-tech world, and that we are paying a big price for that. And in terms of not just the mental health crisis, which is part of that, but all of us need to have better sustained attention, better long-term thinking, more empathic concern for each other, and that you can see the symptoms of this crisis literally just by reading the news. And that's incredibly timely right now. The news seems like it's worse every single month. I mean, it's almost unreadable as far as I'm concerned, especially just this last week. But it's just, it's something that really concerns me. And that's why I feel like the mental health crisis, not to diminish it, is really just a piece of what's going on right now, and that we're all in needs of up-leveling our minds so that we can live on this planet. The other reason why I sort of place it as a crisis is because the other very real crises, equality, climate change, biodiversity, there's a long list. You could look up on any search engine, what are the big global challenges that we face? And you will find, water, this list of things, infectious disease as well. Nowhere do you see that we have a crisis or a grand challenge to help improve our minds. Maybe a mention of drug addiction here and there or suicide, but not how I'm talking about it, which is just all of our function. And I would say that it's this crisis of our cognition that prevents us from solving any of the other crises.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like if we can't fix this, we cannot address climate change. I would be so bold to say that. Like, we already know a lot about climate change. I feel like we keep seeing the same report every 5 years. We even know how we can address it. But something prevents us from doing that. And it's not a technical problem, and it's not a scientific problem. It's a problem of our thinking and our minds. And until we address that, we will constantly have this challenge, and we will threaten our life on this planet. So that's sort of the cognition crisis idea.
Of course, I mean, there are other components to it, like political infighting that prevent solving the climate change. But I'm with you 100% that just one component of the cognition crisis, this deficit in long-term planning, ability needs to be addressed. So it's still a crucial point, but it's just not
for sure. And I would say, I'd say a lot of the political infighting is also related to the cognition crisis. Like if our systems of government and policy creation are not built on the fundamentals of empathic concern, long-term decision making, love, then yeah, of course the political systems are broken. So I think it's even foundational to that process as well. I'm not saying that it'll fix it. I mean, the systems are deeply, rooted in policies and structure that needs to completely be revamped. But I still think at the core of it is that we're just not thinking the way we need to be able to manage global societies the way it exists now.
Absolutely. Capacious thought is the only thing that will get us out of all these problems that we're facing. So one cause that you mentioned in this piece and I think you might have also just mentioned it, of the cognition crisis is longer lifespans. So for instance, with longer lifespans, you're going to have more impairment in cognition, more dementia, things like that. But, and that's not too mysterious. But how is it that, or why is it, or how is it that increased use or consumption of information technology could be having these negative effects on our cognition?
Yeah, that's another great and big question. That was sort of the focus of my book with Larry Rosen, The Distracted Mind, which subtitles Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. And really the thesis is that our brains evolved in a certain condition to accomplish a certain, not teleologically speaking, but it was sort of evolved for survival. And our brains are essentially perception action machines. They perceive the world and now allowing us to respond in some way. And those ways, when it's related to survival, are reproduction, finding food, avoiding toxins. And our brains still largely work that way as well. Now our brains live in a very different world, and especially how technology, mostly I would refer to having a very high speed, powerful computer in your pocket that has communication networks with the rest of the world instantaneously, which almost, most people in the world will have that very soon, if most have it right now. That creates a pressure on our brains that we did not have before. And that our ancient brains, and much of our brain is still the same brain that it was during our evolutionary development, that pressure creates all sorts of chaos and consequences in our behavior and how we live in this world, and impairments in our cognition, fragmented attention, very high rates of reward in very short periods of time, of the opportunity to fragment your attention through multitasking, the unfortunate ability to know what's going on around you with all your friends when you're not there, things, even things of that nature really have an impact on us. And we did not develop our technology in a thoughtful way, nor did we build in monitoring systems to understand what the negative consequences were going to be. And so a lot of the cognition crisis now, I feel, is aggravated by modern day technology. Some of it exists just because we're older, we're living longer, and all systems change with age, and the brain is not exempt from that. But I think that you see the real pressure of technology even exaggerated in older adults, in children and adolescents, and in clinical populations.
One thing that you said that stuck out to me is high rates of reward, and having this high-speed communication device in our pockets. In the past month or two, I've been keeping my phone on airplane mode all day, and until maybe like 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening. And I've just noticed that I feel so much better. And I wonder, this is totally not a scientific statement, but just as the phone comes with high rates of reward, like when you see a funny meme or something like that, there's also high rates of quote unquote punishment. Like when I look at podcast reviews and maybe there's a bad one. Something like this, it's happening all the time. And just as a car wears down from lots of bumps on the road, I imagine that this constant up and down in the brain causes chaos.
100%. It causes chaos in all sorts of ways, from emotional regulation to stress and anxiety, impacting sleep, fragmentation of attention in general, driving more short-term decision-making. I mean, the whole changes in how we feel empathy and compassion to each other. It's all out there and documented in all sorts of ways in different populations. And so that's real. And, I mean, sometimes I just try to imagine and I have children now, so it's easier, of what it's like growing up in a world where all of this communication and pictures of everything are just always distributed. Like, I didn't grow up in that world. It's hard to manage as an adult, but with a developing young adolescent brain, it's almost inconceivable to me. And I've been studying this for 30 years, and it's still mind blowing of how does anyone manage to navigate in a healthy way through adolescence in the system that we have built for them.
Well, just to make this a bit more concrete, since I was speaking quite loosely with my analogy to a car, where do specific brain regions, like one that you write about often is the prefrontal cortex, where do they figure into this problem? How can we make it more concrete, what's happening in our brains?
Yeah, so one of the areas of research that was a big focus of mine up until, it's still in my research program, but as we talked about, I'm much more focused on intervention and trying to build tools to help improve brain function. But the area where I spent a decade focusing on was, how does our brain manage interference, which is part of the conversation we're just having. How do you deal with distraction, irrelevant information that's presented around you, multiple screens, text coming in, all the things that are outside of your goals? How does our brain also deal with another type of interference, which is multitasking? So that's different than distraction in my work. Distraction is information that you're actually trying to suppress that's interfering with your goal. Multitasking is when you make the decision not to suppress that and try to do more than one thing at a time. Both of these are types of interference that my work, and as well as many others, all converge to show that our brains just don't do very well with interference. It degrades our performance, and it causes all sorts of downstream consequences on behavior, which is sort of what we were talking about. But if you go back to the neuroscience, which is where I started all of this, you look at the brains of people that are confronted with interference, whether distraction or multitasking, while you're imaging their brain, either with fMRI or EEG, which is the tools that I use the most. And you see the interference occur. You can see that neural networks that are directed at a particular goal involve the prefrontal cortex, so the front part of our brain, the most evolved part of our brain, also the part of our brain that takes the longest to develop across the human lifespan, that part of the brain, and I'm simplifying because there are many areas of the prefrontal cortex, but that area communicates with other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus involving memory, the amygdala for emotional processing, visual areas, auditory areas, and those large-scale networks are what allow you to focus and to engage on something. But when you have to engage on something else, whether you are pulled away to it involuntarily by a distracting force or whether you voluntarily decide to do something, you don't parallel process in the way that we think of that word. You don't just start another network without this one suffering no decrement. You basically switch. And so in the brain, you see switching of networks. This is what we and others have seen. And with each switch, there's a cost. There's some degradation of the information and the processing that you can pick up even at a performance level, from memory to perceptual processing to other attentional metrics. You can see this cost of of switching between networks. And so that is what occurs in an acute level. If you do that all the time, there is limited data, but the speculation that it becomes how your brain, it's sort of the default of how your brain operates. But because the brain is plastic, sort of connecting to our earlier conversation, it can be corrected, right? The brain can be put into a different state of engagement, a different default of how it tends to engage in the environment. But that's the work that I've done on how the prefrontal cortex, sort of the control center of the brain, how it processes goal-directed information and how interference then degrades that process.
And just to finish this up, maybe hopefully summarize and try something together, is the main thread in the neurological side of the story of the cognition crisis that even though problems might arise in emotional regulation, maybe specific to the amygdala, for instance, the main overriding problem is in the prefrontal cortex. And yeah.
That's my thesis. But, I see it through my lens. The cognition crisis was, and that piece, and when I talk about that, it was not meant to place an overemphasis on sort of the neuroscience of it, but just sort of phenomenologically, this is an observation that I don't see talked about a lot, and I don't see sort of addressed at the level of the UN and other global initiatives that, wow, we need to have better brains, like just all of us, like we need to level it up because we're struggling. That's sort of what that piece was about from a practical perspective of how do you solve that? Just, so many ways, and none of them are, many of them are right. Let's say maybe some of them are wrong, but many of them are right. My particular focus is on prefrontal cortical function and attention as a foundational ability that we have, selective and sustained attention in a top-down manner, that I see as a sort of basement level, a foundation upon which all those other aspects of cognition rest. That if the attentional framework is not strong and established, that it impacts how we perceive, how we feel, how we think, how we imagine, and we can't correct it if we don't build better attentional systems. So that is, the sort of connecting piece between the cognition crisis message, which is like, whoa, this is so big right now and it affects all of us. Why are we not talking about this all the time? And why do we not have big global initiatives to address it? And then how we can is by improving attention as one of the ways. And how do we improve attention is because our brains are plastic, and we have not really thought deeply and put enough resources into how we can harness our brain's plasticity maximally to improve our attention and then lead to better cognition.
And speaking of these big global initiatives and of the UN and other large bodies, government, education, the medical establishment, without getting into the specifics yet of particular treatments, which I think will be one component of this, what are the sorts of ways in which these organizations need to adapt to adequately combat this crisis? What are the sorts of global initiatives?
It's a great question. This one's a little outside of my lane, in all honesty. I like to think as big as I can, but I also know my limitations and sort of global policy making, and at this level is really beyond the details I have in terms of implementing it. My goal here is to ring a bell, say this is a bigger problem than mental health, and that we need to put it on a list as a start. Because if you search for all these global initiatives and these big global challenges, it's not on the list. And so it's clearly not in people's consciousness and the decision makers that we have a cognition crisis, that our climate change and biodiversity crisis that is real is unaddressable in a meaningful and sustainable way if we don't deal with the fact that we can't sustain our attention, that we can't make long-term decisions, that we don't feel enough empathy for each other and for nature. And so my first sort of mission was, wow, wouldn't it be great if this was at least on a list somewhere? I have never seen this really prioritized as a grand challenge. And then how do you implement this in a way that's actionable, that leads to that change, is such a bigger question that I don't certainly have all the answers. My own focus has been to develop technologies to address that, but it is way bigger than that.